Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Mr. Chris Bake, the member of Executive Committee of Vitol. Geopolitics was certainly at the forefront in 2021. A lot of cases. We've seen even recent days, very serious tensions on the Ukraine-Russian border. We've got the nuclear talks in Vienna, the Iran issue, the nuclear issue there bubbling up seemingly in a complicated place. And even one of the more dominant narratives through the year, the China-US moving into a Cold War, perhaps an overused analogy, but nonetheless a difficult relationship there. How do you reflect on some of the geopolitical hotspots over the last year?
I think they've all the issues you mentioned, and I'll throw in the other favorites such as Libya and Venezuela too. All those issues have been on boil throughout the year. But I think the real push-pull, my takeaway this year has been looking at the resilience of demand in the economy despite COVID. So a full recovery of global demand to 2019 levels and higher, versus a very precise response by OPEC and OPEC Plus to try and balance supply demand. In the background, whether the US would be able to agree to JCPOA terms and conditions with Iran has been there. Obviously, it's a catch-22 because Iran does not view an executive order as sustainable on the medium term because the change of administration could change it again. So they're saying, you've got to give us an incentive to come back to the table. And by the way, we are selling our production into non-dollar markets, non-fungible markets on an ongoing basis. Sanctions have not been enforced in any notable way. So they feel that they can continue to act with impunity. The US has limited tools to bring them to the table. So it's a difficult balancing act, but the US and other nations should be concerned about continued nuclear enrichment, which is clearly happening too. So that is one area of balance. You then have, as you indicated, the concern by Russia as to what's happening on their borders with an ever-expanded NATO presence and support in the Ukraine, and how are they going to react to that? Obviously, the world from a Russian perspective, sitting in Moscow looking south, is very different than the world from our perspective or US perspective looking towards the Russian from the west or from north, from across the Atlantic or from Northwest Europe. So trying to understand how to reconcile that is complicated. And yes, the Chinese-US tensions in the South China Sea and beyond, and the US and China's interest to try and continue to secure its raw material supply and use its growing international reach to make sure that it has all its necessary energy and raw material supplies is going to continue to cause tensions, especially as the West realizes that they have probably been less strategic in solving for some of the base raw material supplies that they need in order to compete in a new energy or sustainable energy environment. So there's certainly a lot of tension there.
If one just drills down into one of those issues, let's say the Iran piece, we've seen in the region a lot of bilaterals taking place. We had the UAE go into Turkey, first time in a long time. UAE go into Tehran for meetings. We've had the leadership of Saudi Arabia tour the region, Turkey into Qatar, all of these only in the last week. How do you read all of that regional activity while these nuclear talks are ongoing in Vienna?
Listen, we don't have any specific insight. We're an energy company. We're not a political organization. But
you watch it, obviously. You see it like everybody else.
For sure, and the consensus. I mean, the view is that as the U.S. has taken a step back or perceived, whether they have or they have not, the perception that the US has taken a step back in the Gulf and exerting influence in the Gulf.
It certainly has been consolidated, that idea, at least, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan earlier in the year went so badly wrong.
Correct, and the U.S. and the West, and the question mark, the growing question mark as to what the U.S. is willing or not willing to stand for geopolitically. Then I think, or we think, that the alliances between the Gulf states and the various axes of support, including Turkey, that have happened, and Israel as a regional operator, they have begun to realize that they need to work together and fend for themselves, because they could not always or might not be able to always turn to the US for whatever strategic support they need. So I think it's a telling of the current geopolitics that the region is saying we need to create our own alliances and we need to create our own stability in order to try and consolidate the growth platform that we need to attract, to be seen internationally as a stable area, and to attract direct foreign investment, which the Saudis for sure are very actively pursuing with NOM and the emergence of a much more transparent, if you will, from an investment point of view, arena. Obviously, there's issues there that still need to be dealt with by them, and the UAE is very much seen as a viewing themselves more and more, not only in North Africa, not only in their region, but also in places in North Africa, including the Sahel, as to how to try and stabilize the region a little bit. Obviously, there's some big issues, Syria and the Iranian interface there, Lebanon and the Iranian interface there. They don't affect the day-to-day oil market so much because of limited demand there or limited production. But in terms of the region, there's clearly an effort to try and reestablish a new sense of cooperation, collaboration, to try and stabilize, because clearly engagement with Yemen has not worked. It's cost billions. It's affected hundreds of millions of lives and to little gain. And I think there's a reevaluation of how to engage.